Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and I'm so excited to finally bring you a very requested video, and that is my recommendations for science fiction horror books. If you have been following my channel for any length of time, you probably know that science fiction and horror are my two favorite genres, and I really love when they intersect. I know a lot of you also really enjoy sci-fi horror, especially on screen, so a lot of you have asked me for recommendations for books to read. Now, the two genres are very vast, so I think I have a really good variety here. Books that take elements of horror and science fiction and spin them in all sorts of different directions. I also know that I have people who are going to be watching this video looking for horror books and people that are more so looking for science fiction. So I will kind of let you know which way these books lean, because some of them definitely lean more into the technology and some of them are more scary. So I will give you warnings and information as we go along. But I think I have a great variety here, so let's get started. First, I want to talk about The Luminous Dead by Caitlin Starling, and this is a debut novel about a woman who is desperate for cash, and so she takes a really dangerous, strange job where she is cave diving. Now, this takes place on another planet, so you know she's not cave diving on Earth, but somewhere else, and it's a very dangerous mission. She is going alone, and you know that people have gone on this mission before and have never gotten as far as she is at this point, and so the entire story is her alone in these caves, and her only form of communication is with her handler. So this person that is giving her instructions, telling her where to go, and she's getting this information through a headset. This story also involves a lot of really cool technology because she is in this suit that basically provides all of her needs. So her food and everything she needs to survive and keep warm is provided by this strange technology. But otherwise, there isn't a lot of world building that happens. You really don't get to understand much of the planet. And as you can imagine with a book like this, this is very claustrophobic, and I found it to be very suspenseful. In terms of horror, it's very, very light on the horror. I would more consider this to be first science fiction and secondary horror, but even the science fiction elements, like I said, are very quiet. You know that there is some newer technology involved so that she can do this cave diving, but I do think this one is really accessible to people that don't read a lot of science fiction, but at the same time, I don't think it's very scary, so I would confidently recommend it to science fiction readers that are a little bit more self-proclaimed scaredy cats and don't really want something super scary. So definitely recommend this one. It was a really interesting, quiet story, very suspenseful, and it had some great unexpected queer representation in it as well. Next, I want to recommend one of my favorite novellas, and that is Fina by Nino Sapri. And this takes place in a Scandinavian furniture store that sort of seems like IKEA, but it's technically not. And it follows a group of disgruntled employees that are forced to go and look for a woman who has disappeared. However, they find out early on that she has not simply wandered off into another display, but actually wandered off into another multiverse. And they find out that all of the furniture stores are actually connected to different multiverses. And so these employees are forced to go into the multiverses and try to track this older woman down. This story also has an element of a relationship because the two employees used to date, and the one employee is non-binary, so you do get some really interesting queer representation included here. This book, I would say, is first and foremost science fiction. It definitely plays heavily on the multiverse aspect to it, but it also has that horror element to it because of the fact that some of the multiverses they go into aren't so nice, and it's not a spoiler to say that they come across some hungry furniture in one of the worlds, and so you definitely get those horror elements coming in, and they are a lot of fun, and it's just an enjoyable read. So not super scary, it's more of a relationship and character-based story, but it definitely has enough horror that I feel comfortable to include it on this list here. Next, I want to talk about Beneath the Rising by Premi Mohammed, and this is a really unique one once again, and it follows two best friends that have known each other since childhood. Now they are reunited as adults. The woman in this friendship is a genius and a scientist who is a bit of a child prodigy who grew up just making incredible discoveries. And so now as an adult, she invites her friend over to show him what she has done, and she has created a clean energy reactor. However, something has gone wrong and she ends up tearing a hole and ends up unleashing some possible entities into our world. Now, this book definitely has a science fiction beginning to it with that clean reactor starting off events, but I'll say that the horror in this book is more mystical or even Lovecraftian in style, and so it actually becomes a little bit more fantastical. So while this is a sci-fi horror book, I also will say that it leans a little bit into almost fantasy, but I very much liked a lot of things in this book. It was very much unique. I love the friendship in this book. I don't see friendships represented enough in my fiction, and I just thought that you really get to see this long-standing relationship and how it has grown and changed. You also get to see conversations about class and privilege and great diversity in this book. I loved so much about it. This is one I've done a separate review for. For all the books that I have separate reviews, I will have them linked down below, but definitely recommend this one because I don't see enough people talking about it, and I just thought it was a really unique one. Next, I want to recommend Colebrook by Tim Levin, and this follows a group of scientists working in the Appalachian Mountains. They are attempting to burrow into a multiverse. And right at the beginning of the story, this is not spoilers whatsoever, they actually accomplished their goal and they are able to contact another world. However, they do not have the situation under control, and something wanders in from this other multiverse. And what comes in is possibly something that looks a lot like a zombie. Now, for those of you looking for a sci-fi horror book with more of the horror elements, this one is for you. So it definitely has those science fiction elements to it. You get people exploring a different world, conversations about multiverses, and it's a theme that I really enjoy in my science fiction. But at the same time, you definitely get a strong horror aspect. I would shelve this book particularly in the horror genre. And with zombies, you have to know it's going to be a little bit gory or gruesome, not as much as in other books, so I would still recommend this one even if you're a little bit squeamish about body horror. It's very toned down, but you do have these bloodthirsty, undead-like creatures coming across, and you get to see them spread into our world. So again, a really good blend of the two, because again, you get that multiverse, these two worlds intersecting and getting to see how the worlds are the same and yet different, and conversations around that philosophy. And at the same time, you get some zombies. So definitely a fresh take on the zombie fiction subgenre. And even if you're not really a fan of zombies, I still recommend checking this one out. Now I want to talk about another novella, and that is The Ghost Line by Andrew Neil Gray and J.S. Harbison. This I describe as a haunted house story set in space. It is about two salvagers that go off to inspect and rip apart an old abandoned ship. However, when they get in, it seems like there is something or some kind of presence watching them, and strange things start to happen. I don't know why, but I've always connected so much with this novella, and I've talked about it several times, but I really liked so many aspects to it. As someone who's married myself, I loved the representation of the married couple. Now, in terms of horror, this one was not very scary, but it did have an element of creepiness to it and definitely had an element of suspense. I just found this one to be very unsettling, very atmospheric, and who doesn't want a haunted house story set in space? And especially for those of you that are looking for space horror, this is it. This one takes place in space, so here's your recommendation for some proper space horror. Now I want to recommend Fledgling by Octavia E. Butler, and this is set in a world where vampires exist. However, it's a different take on vampires because there's actually a scientific or science fiction explanation for them. You find out that they are possibly from a different planet, possibly aliens, and they go on more so because in this world, one of the vampires that we're following is actually darker skinned, which is not typically part of vampire lore. This person has been bioengineered in order for them to be able to be out in the daylight, and have their skin darker so they are not affected by it. Now, normally when you see vampire fiction, it tends to cross over more with fantasy, so I thought it was really interesting to find a take where it actually crossed over more with science fiction. Now, I do need to give warnings that, like a lot of vampire fiction, there's definitely some really strange things around the age of the characters. There's a lot of sexual content, which can seem really questionable when it comes to consent, but the characters are much older than they appear. Still weird some people out. Just go in knowing that if it's not for you, that's okay. But if you're looking for a vampire story with more of a sci-fi spin, I definitely recommend this. And of course, Octavia Butler brings such a wonderful, diverse, own voices story to the table. And finally, I can't do a horror sci-fi recommendations video without talking about one of my personal favorites, and that is Into the Drowning Deep by Mira Grant. This is a story about a group of scientists that go off in search of a ship that years ago went out to film a mockumentary about mermaids. However, they never came back, and now years later this group of scientists are trying to figure out what happened by going out and investigating for themselves. This is a fantastic creature horror with a heavy emphasis on science fiction through learning about the biology of the mermaids. When I first read this book, I did consider it to be more science fiction because you do get to spend a lot of time with the scientists that are talking about the mermaid biology, which really started to seem really real, and I really wanted to believe it as I was going along because the author really spent a lot of time building that up. But at the same time, there are some gruesome scenes in this one. If you are more squirmish about horror, this one is probably the most horrific of everything I'm going to talk about here, so keep that in mind. But at the same time, it was a lot of fun, and it's a very fresh take on the creature feature genre of horror. So if you are a science fiction reader, I would recommend it as long as you are okay with a little bit more gore than you would normally see in science fiction. And if you're a horror reader, go in knowing that it's probably not the scariest, most gruesome book you've ever read. It is more toned down than some of the things that get the straight horror label, but it definitely has some good elements there. And I do want to mention there is also a prequel novella, which you don't need to read first, but if you do want to check that one out, it tells the story of what actually happened to the mockumentary crew, and that one leans much more into the horror side. It doesn't have a lot of science to it. So if you're looking for more just a straight up creature slasher story and you don't want the biology aspects, you might want to start with the prequel, but I personally recommend both. You can read them in either order and they're both fantastic. So that is it for this video. Let me know how I did in the comment sections down below. Did I add any new books to your own TBR? And I would absolutely love to get your recommendations for your favorite science fiction horror books, because I would really like to do a part 2 of this recommendation series. But in order to do that, I need to keep reading because it's kind of hard to find these books despite how much they are demanded by readers. So help me out with some great recommendations. Otherwise, if you're new to my channel, please consider subscribing. As you can probably guess, I read a lot of science fiction, horror, as well as some thrillers and fantasy. If you're already subscribed, please consider liking, leaving a comment, hitting that notification bell, and it would actually make me really happy if you'd consider sharing this on Twitter or Reddit or other places, because I've definitely put a lot of work into planning this video and I would love for people to share it around. Thank you so much for watching. I will talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.